It took roughly an hour for everyone Garth had summoned to assemble. Rian spent the time sequestered in the dim meeting hall, systematically consuming a bowl of lukewarm soup. It was a thick, highly spiced broth choked with dense chunks of entirely flavorless meat. Though unappetizing, it satisfied his immediate hunger, sending a much-needed jolt of physical energy through his sluggish limbs. Across the room, Zarek paced the stone floor relentlessly. The old man was an erratic pendulum of nervous energy, his hands repeatedly smoothing his brown rags as if desperate to begin. Since Garth's departure, neither man had uttered a single word to the other. When the hall finally filled with armored town guards, the heavy oak doors groaned open. Garth strode inside, followed closely by a mountain of a man, boasting an unruly thicket of black hair and a scruffy, untamed beard. They marched directly to the head of the long table where Rian sat, his sheathed longsword resting on the wood beside him. Rian looked up, assessing the newcomer. Around the room, the gathered guards took their seats in absolute silence. No one murmured. No one poured wine. They simply sat, their unblinking eyes plastered directly onto Rian. They were waiting for him to command them. "Ah, Rian, I had heard you were finally awake, sir," the large man said. He offered a wide smile that revealed a jagged row of crooked, severely yellowed teeth. A thick, violent scar tore down the right side of his face, beginning well above his eyebrow and cutting across his cheek to frame the corner of his mouth. The wound looked remarkably fresh, the tissue still an angry, puffy pink. The man immediately noticed Rian analyzing the disfigurement. "Aye, this is what those vile things did to me," he said, pointing a thick finger at his own face before gesturing vaguely toward the bandages Rian had discarded. "Same time they got you on the field, sir. Glad to see you're functional." "Thank you," Rian responded carefully, keeping his tone measured. "Though, I apologize, I don't recall your name." "Varric, sir! Varric Bortath!" the man boomed, proudly flexing a pair of massive arms heavily armored in iron mail. "Your finest and strongest knight!" Garth let out a sharp scoff of pure contempt from Rian's other side. "I think you'll find I am the strongest, you absolute brute. At least I wasn't reckless enough to take a massive steel slash clean down my face." Varric snorted, instantly reaching out with a massive gloved hand to trap Garth in a headlock, aggressively ruffling the younger soldier's hair. The pair began to aggressively tussle against the masonry until Zarek let out a sharp, dry cough to shatter the display. "That's enough, lads," the old man muttered from the shadows. "Focus!" Despite the underlying paranoia creeping at the edges of his mind, Rian felt a genuine wave of relief wash over him. The air of rowdy laughter and casual mischief from these men, the company that claimed him as their leader, was a welcome escape from the constant barrage of rigid, shifting facts he had been subjected to since waking. For a fleeting moment, he allowed himself to believe he could genuinely trust them. They felt like friends. Varric stepped up to Rian's left side, unhooking a tightly rolled cylinder of parchment from his belt and smoothing it flat across the table. Garth quickly claimed the right side, sliding Rian's empty soup bowl onto one corner of the paper to anchor it, while carefully aligning the sheathed longsword along the opposite edge. With the document flattened, the surrounding guards leaned inward, their breath heavy in the enclosed space. "Now, last time we analyzed this layout, Varric began, but a sharp, sudden cough from Zarek cut him off entirely. "Remember, soldiers?" Zarek interjected, his dark eyes scanning the table. "Our general here has just survived a deeply traumatic ordeal. Be exceptionally wary of your words." A thick, uncomfortable silence immediately smothered the room. No one replied to the old man. The guards merely shifted their weight, a strange, sour taste lingering in the air. Rian watched Zarek cautiously, his mind racing. Why would they need to be wary of what they say? They were there. They are my men. What are they hiding from me? Zarek dragged a wooden stool into the corner of the room, settling his spry frame down with a soft sigh. Pay no mind to these old bones. Carry on. Varric cleared his throat roughly, breaking the spell. Well, going by your exact orders the last time we stood here, the strategy doesn't require much alteration. It was a flawless plan, sir. Aye, that it was, Garth chimed in, eliciting a chorus of low chuckles from the table. Rian ignored the flattery, focusing his entire attention on the document before him. It was a map, though a remarkably crude one. "We are positioned right here," Varric explained, planting a thick, calloused finger onto a cluster of roughly sketched squares, surrounded by a jagged line meant to represent the walls of Nostrador. "And this is the exact perimeter where we intercepted their raiding party last, where you had your wee accident, sir." He slid his finger down the parchment, stopping over a stark emblem etched in dark red ink. A skull and crossbones. Rian decided to test the waters, knowing the men were watching his face for any spark of recognition. He leaned back into his heavy wooden chair, crossing his arms to exude an aura of detached confidence. "How far out would you estimate that red marker to be?" Rian asked smoothly. "A mile? Perhaps 2? "Yes!" Varric beamed eagerly, his crooked teeth flashing. "More or less exactly a single mile. Did the memory return to you, sir?" "Yes," Rian lied without a shred of hesitation. He needed them to believe he was recovering. He needed to embody the commander they wanted him to be, even though a nagging logic whispered in his ear. "Why are you their general?" He looked around the table. Most of these hardened killers were twice his age, boasting decades of weathered experience. He was barely half their age. "Last time, the raiding party was entirely on foot," Varric continued, his voice rising in volume. "They must have heard our armor clanking from a mile away with those massive, pathetic ears of theirs, you know." The room instantly erupted into a raucous broil of harsh laughter. One of the larger guards slapped the table so hard his iron goblet flipped over, sending a small wave of water splashing directly across the lap of the man opposite him. Zarek, however, didn't laugh. He sat perfectly still in his corner, his dark eyes boring directly into Rian's face through the commotion. "This time, we shall strike them under the absolute cover of pitch darkness," Varric growled when the laughter subsided. "Our scouts report they've held that exact camp ever since your incident. It is as if they are actively waiting for something." "Their deaths!" a guard shouted from the far corner, triggering another wave of roaring amusement. Rian's eyes drifted to Garth. The young soldier wasn't truly laughing. He was merely forcing a tight plastic smile to remain part of the group. Seizing the distraction, Rian's gaze swept across the parchment. The map was exceptionally sparse. It detailed the fortress of Nostrudor, a small perimeter of surrounding wasteland, and the solitary red mark of the battlefield. Beyond that, the paper was completely blank. "Is this all the world is?" Rian thought, a cold sensation turning in his stomach. Does the entirety of civilization exist in this one tiny pocket of rock? He noticed the top left corner of the parchment had begun to curl back in on itself, obscuring the edge. Rian reached out, his hand gently brushing the stiff paper flat against the table. There was nothing beneath the curl, only a faint, ghostly texture. Rian squinted. The paper in the upper quadrant was a shade or two lighter than the rest of the map. Someone had meticulously scraped the parchment clean, erasing whatever lines, mountains, or kingdoms had once been drawn there. Before he could investigate further, Varric's heavy, leather-gloved fist slammed down onto the center of the table with a resounding thud. The sudden vibration caused the stiff map to snap back, rolling itself tightly into a cylinder. "Tomorrow, then, before the sun rises in the west, is when I recommend we execute the strike. Does that sound acceptable, General?" Varric asked, the rowdy crowd suddenly freezing, eagerly awaiting his command. Rian paused, the weight of the room pressing down on his chest. His thoughts were a chaotic, disjointed mess. This was moving far too quickly. On one hand, every single person he had encountered since waking up had systematically pushed him toward this specific offensive, urging him to slaughter a people he couldn't even remember. On the other hand, if these men truly were his friends, perhaps the raw adrenaline of a real battlefield would act as a catalyst, shattering the amnesia clawing at his skull. He realized then, with a chilling clarity, that the men in this room hadn't been waiting for his strategic input at all. They were only waiting for his compliance. "I agree," Rian spoke, throwing his voice across the stone hall with a resonant power. "Tomorrow, before dawn, we strike." A deafening roar of cheers shattered the silence of the hall. Varric and Garth immediately plunged into the center of the room, joining a dense crowd of guards who were already clanking their armor in celebration. Zarek remained seated in his dark corner. He offered Rian a small, tight smile. "Those dryads won't know what's about to hit them," the old man murmured before standing up and dissolving into the celebrating throng. Rian slowly stood up from the table, turning his back on the noise to face the stone wall. A roaring iron brazier flickered nearby, its orange and yellow flames dancing hypnotically across the rough masonry. The vibrant, shifting colors resonated deeply within him, pulling at a phantom memory he couldn't quite grasp. He had learned by now to simply accept these internal echoes, whether they belonged to reality or a fractured mind. Perhaps it was a remnant of a childhood long forgotten. But as he stared into the fire, a single word detached itself from the old man's parting statement, echoing ominously in his thoughts. "Dryads," Rian frowned. "Is that our name for the elves?" "Dryads," it sounds remarkably soft. Pretty, even. The word lingered on his tongue, refusing to leave, tasting far more familiar than the name Nostrador ever had. Before he could ponder further, a booming shout from the crowd shattered his isolation. His men were beckoning him over, raising their goblets high, demanding their general join the revelry of the bloodbath to come. Several hours evaporated into the night. Under Rian's calculated orders, a vanguard consisting of half the guard complement had been dispatched ahead of the main force to establish a concealed staging camp a few hundred meters from the target perimeter. Rian had selected Varric to command the forward unit, with Garth operating as his direct support. Varric had assured him the path was a straight, unrelenting shot through the lowlands, tapering into a beaten dirt trail that scaled a massive, rocky ridge overlooking the valley where the enemy camp resided. Now, the main body of the cavalry moved out. Zarek rode a steady mount adjacent to Rian as they approached the towering main gates of Nostrador. The night sky was choked with a thick, clinging mist that effectively veiled the starlight. The moon hung at its midpoint, casting long, pale shadows of the ancient stone bastions across the courtyard of the gatehouse. Rian sat atop a magnificent white steed, its saddle and reins adorned with heavy red and gold leather straps. He kept his eyes locked onto the glowing moon, completely enamored by its cold, distant beauty. Zarek guided his horse slightly ahead, his voice cutting through the steady rhythm of hooves. "I shall remain behind at the staging camp if it's all the same to you, sir. These old bones are far too brittle for any actual steel clashing." Rian offered a silent nod, shifting uncomfortably in his saddle. His thighs were already aching, and he was entirely uncertain of how to properly manipulate the leather reins. He spent the journey meticulously observing how Zarek and the surrounding riders held their posture, desperately mimicking their movements to avoid throwing himself off the animal. "Nervous?" Zarek called out over his shoulder. "A bit," Rian confessed, tightening his grip on the leather straps. "It's more that I simply don't know what to expect when the steel is drawn." "No one truly does in the theater of war, son," Zarek replied smoothly, his horse picking up speed. "Just let your veterans do the heavy lifting out there. Oh, and wear a damned helmet this time, clear?" The old man's voice faded into the darkness as his mount galloped through the iron threshold of the gatehouse. Behind Rian, the thunderous rhythm of approaching hooves swelled. Dozens of heavily armored riders began to stream past his position, their steeds neighing violently into the mist as the men chanted crude war cries. "Just follow their lead," Rian whispered fiercely to himself, his chest tightening. "Follow their lead and you'll survive." He dug his heels sharply into the white horse's flanks. The animal surged forward, seamlessly falling into rank with the armored vanguard ahead. Behind them, the fortress of Nostrador shrunk into a massive, jagged silhouette against the starless sky, the faint, purplish tint of the pre-dawn atmosphere beginning to pool at the base of the distant cliffs. As the cavalry crossed into the open wilderness, Rian found his eyes automatically drawn toward the sweeping, ancient ridgelines flanking the valley. He had no logical explanation for the pull, but the sight of those high, rocky crests triggered a profound, aching importance in his chest. He cast one final look back over his shoulder. With a deafening metallic crash, The massive iron portcullis of Nostrudor slammed violently into the stone floor of the gatehouse, locking them out in the wild, uncharted expanse of Aetheria. "Blasted scar!" Varric hissed under his breath, his voice laced with venom. The large knight was crouched low behind a massive, rotting fallen log on the crest of the primary ridgeline, his dark eyes squinting hard into the valley below. He repeatedly rubbed at his face, trying to clear the blurry haze clouding his vision. Reaching out with a heavy hand, he grabbed Garth's leather sleeve, violently pulling the younger soldier down beside him. "What do you see down there, boy?" Varric whispered hoarsely. "My sight is still bleeding from the mist." Garth shifted, resting his chin against the damp bark of the log as he focused on the valley floor. Spread out in a tight defensive ring below were the unmistakable remnants of a camp. Roughly 15 to 20 slender figures were scattered across the perimeter, their shapes dimly illuminated by a series of strange lanterns emitting a vibrant, eerie blue light. The lanterns hung from beautifully carved wooden beams driven deep into the dirt. "I count at least a dozen, maybe more," Garth whispered back, easing himself down onto his knees. "But we'd need to descend the slope to get an accurate tally." He paused, his brow furrowing as he stared back over the log. "Huh. It doesn't make any sense." "What doesn't?" Varric snapped. "They've barely moved in days, Varric," Garth said, his voice dropping. "They're just sitting there." Varric didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned around, leaning his heavy mail-clad back against the rotting wood. "You know, I swear I found tracks leading away from this perimeter earlier." "Tracks?" "Aye, footprints. Dozens of them, scattering outward into the hills in completely different directions." Garth turned as well, mimicking Varric's posture against the log. "Do you think they're hunting for something?" Varric shifted his head, looking up toward the far side of the valley, where the parallel ridgeline rose sharply into the sky. "It's funny how they seem to be systematically searching the exact ridge over there." Garth looked thoroughly puzzled. "Funny? How is that?" A sudden, violent rustling of leaves shattered the night air immediately in front of them. Varric's hand instantly clamped over Garth's mouth, a sharp "shh" escaping his lips. A scout from their own vanguard materialized out of the brush, his face pale. "Sir, we have movement. Not far from our flank. Look!" The man pointed a trembling finger down the right slope. Slowly, the three men peered around the edge of the log. Just below the crest where the hill began its sharp descent into the darkness, a shape was actively stirring in the brush. The figure carried one of those strange, blue-tinted lanterns, but the light was fractured, casting long, distorted shadows that made it impossible to discern who, what, or how many were approaching. Varric's hand instantly dropped to the pommel of his sword, the steel sliding from its sheath with a faint hiss. Garth reluctantly followed suit, his blade trembling slightly. "Should we not hold our position and wait for the general to arrive with the main column?" Garth urged in a frantic whisper. "Nah," Varric muttered, a predatory grin cutting through his black beard. "The general can have his fun when he arrives. We need to liquidate these scouts before they spot the vanguard. Come." Garth grabbed Varric's heavy iron shoulder, physically anchoring him for a fraction of a second. "Wait, what if they aren't scouts at all?" Varric glinted at the movement below, then looked back at the boy. "Well then, we'd best capture one of the bastards and force them to tell us what they are." Without waiting for a response, Varric broke cover, his broadsword drawn as he crept down the slope, the scout flanking his left. Garth hesitated for 3 rapid heartbeats, his eyes darting back toward the path where Rian was supposed to appear, before reluctantly sprinting to keep pace. The trio advanced into the thick brush, freezing every few paces whenever the flickering blue lantern light shifted in the distance. The wilderness was eerily, suffocatingly quiet. The only sounds fracturing the night were the low, melancholy sigh of the wind through the pines and the occasional sharp hoot of a nesting bird, sounds that barely muffled the heavy, rhythmic thud of their boots. Garth could practically feel the suffocating unease radiating off the men around him. "Keep your guard up, you two," Varric growled, his eyes fixed on the brush ahead. "You know exactly what these monstrous beasts are capable of doing to a man." He pointedly glared at Garth as he spoke. "So, are we capturing them, or are we executing them?" Garth asked, his stomach turning at either prospect. "We see how they play it," Varric replied coldly, If they surrender, we bag 'em. If they don't— Shh! Wait, where did the light— The advanced scout suddenly cut them off, leaning his entire torso forward through a break in the branches. The blue light had vanished entirely. The valley was pitch black. The scout stood up slightly higher, straining his neck to catch a line of sight over a boulder. I think they're— A sharp, terrifying whistling sound sliced through the dark. A massive, iron-tipped arrow violently pierced the scout's upper chest, the sheer kinetic force driving his body backwards into the dirt. He collapsed instantly, a series of wet, gargling sounds escaping his throat before his limbs went entirely limp. Garth gasped, a cold wave of terror seizing his chest as he threw himself flat into the freezing mud. Varric, however, roared in fury. He hoisted his massive broadsword high above his head and stood perfectly upright. "Let's go!" he screamed, charging blindly into the dark with the terrifying velocity of a man possessed. Garth lay prone in the dirt, his eyes locked onto the dead scout mere inches from his face. "You are a soldier of Nostrador!" he screamed at himself internally, his teeth chattering. "Get up and fight!" Bracing both hands against the wet mud, he hoisted himself onto his feet, drawing his blade with a loud metallic scrape. He charged into the black void following Varric's path. The trail ahead was completely blind, but the occasional glint of moonlight bouncing off Varric's heavy mail and the echoing, bloodthirsty shouts of the night allowed Garth to navigate the terrain. Another arrow zipped past Garth's left ear, the wind of its passage hot against his skin. He cast a desperate glance back toward the high ridge, praying for the thunderous charge of the cavalry, but the horizon remained dark. As his eyes adjusted to the gloom, the battlefield materialized. Varric was already locked in a brutal, chaotic blade dance with a figure of an incredibly similar, tall build. Excluding himself, there were 3 entities on the field. Varric and his attacker were a blur of clashing steel, while a third figure stood perfectly motionless several paces away, a massive bow pulled taut, aiming directly at Garth's chest. Instinct took over. Garth dived violently to his right, executing a rough forward roll across the rocks before scrambling back to his feet. A third arrow tore through the air where he had just been standing, embedding itself into a thick pine trunk with a violent crack. "Just keep moving!" Garth screamed in his own mind, his breath coming in ragged, desperate gasps as sweat poured down his neck. He watched the archer leap toward the sheer edge of the ridge, unleashing a high, melodic whistle down into the valley camp. It wasn't a harsh, piercing military signal. It sounded remarkably like the complex call of an exotic bird. Garth closed the distance, sprinting into the fray. He lifted his sword with both hands, bringing it crashing down directly into the space between Varric and his attacker to break their deadlock. "Go, boy! Intercept the archer! This one belongs to me!" Varric spat, his face contorted in rage as he drove the heel of his heavy iron boot straight into his opponent's ribs. An audible, sickening thump echoed through the trees, throwing the attacker backwards and buying the 2 human soldiers a momentary second to breathe. Garth slid past Varric's flank, dropping into a rigid defensive guard as he faced the archer. The archer turned her full attention to Garth. She didn't reach into her quiver for another arrow. Instead, she slid her slender hands down to the absolute center of her longbow. Garth's eyes widened as the moonlight caught the weapon. It wasn't crafted from wood. The lower half of the bow gleamed with a polished, lethal metallic sheen. With a fluid, mesmerizing flourish, the archer spun the weapon. It was a bow blade. The upper half functioned as a standard recurve bow, but the lower limb extended into a long, lethal, curved steel scimitar that pointed directly at Garth's throat. Behind him, the violent clang of steel resumed as Varric re-engaged his target. "Put down your bow," Garth stammered, his voice cracking as he raised his sword, "and surrender, please." For some unexplainable reason, Garth's hands began to shake uncontrollably. A profound, unnatural unease washed over him, amplified by the fact that he couldn't fully see his target's features. Their faces were completely swallowed by the shadows of the canopy, outlined only by the cold silver of the moon. The female archer held her ground, her stance perfectly balanced. When she spoke, her voice was sharp, melodic, and entirely devoid of fear. "Not a chance, human. I'm simply stalling for time, so please, continue taking your time, scum." The sheer aura of bravery and unyielding courage radiating from the woman sent a jolt of genuine terror through Garth's chest. "Stalling?" Garth muttered, though the horrific realization hit him a split second before the answer arrived. The loose dirt and gravel along the edge of the ridgeline suddenly began to cascade down the slope. 5 slender silhouettes hoisted themselves over the rocky crest in perfect, silent unison, drawing flashing blades as they flanked the female archer. Garth backed up a step, his sword wavering as he took in the odds. "Varric, what do we do? We're entirely outnumbered." Varric delivered a brutal, driving shove that forced his opponent back several paces before sprinting to Garth's side, using his massive frame to shield the younger soldier. He didn't look at the elves. His eyes were fixed entirely on the high path behind them. "Are we?" Varric growled, a mad grin splitting his bearded face. As if responding to his cue, the night air was shattered by the thunderous, deafening roar of galloping hooves. A dozen massive war horses crested the high ridgeline, their riders silhouetted against the purple dawn as they held their long swords high into the sky. With a unified, bloodthirsty chant, the cavalry leapt down the steep incline, initiating a devastating full-velocity charge directly into the center of the elven scouts. Garth's eyes locked onto the lead rider. Maneuvering his mount at the absolute vanguard of the assault was the distinct green tunic and flowing gray cloak of Rian. Their general had arrived. In a single chaotic heartbeat, the tide of the entire battle was violently rewritten.